Our culture needs a sexual ethic focused on personal relationships and social justice rather than particular sexual acts, where all adults have the right and responsibility to lead sexual lives that express love and justice and mutuality and commitment and consent and even pleasure, grounded in respect for the body and for the vulnerability that intimacy brings, an ethic that fosters physical, emotional, and spiritual health. That's radical. And it's radical because I'm standing in a church. So who is transmitting that message? Where can we learn this? Where will our children learn this, if not at home or in the church? Now, at All Souls, we are invited to bring our whole selves to church, our whole soul. And that means our struggles, as well as our celebrations of who and how we love. What we don't find often enough in church is age-appropriate and clear messages about sex that don't include fear and shame. Even for Unitarians. When people ask me what I do for a living, part of the problem is that, as I mentioned to the kids, when I say minister, most people believe they have to leave some part of themselves out of the conversation. They begin to apologize and check themselves. They try not to swear or talk about parts of their lives that they might think are inappropriate because they're ashamed. Now, I also have experiences in premarital counseling. I've experienced some discomfort and shame about sex, and even more surprisingly, I've experienced a reluctance to have an age-appropriate conversation with our children. It's as though we support the idea of comprehensive sexual education in theory, but in practice, my little girl, my little boy is too innocent or young to have that conversation. But the thing is that they're going to get the information. They're going to get messages everywhere else. And your message is the most important and often the least supported message that they'll receive. It's as though if we don't have the conversation about sex, we can stay innocent. And if we don't have the conversation with our children, they can stay innocent. But that kind of a view of innocence or purity is dripping with irrational and unfounded religious guilt. And I want to tell you something this morning, that it is not healthy to perpetuate that myth for yourself or for your children. Being sexual is part of being human. And we must begin to take that seriously for the benefit of our own health, the health of our relationships, and for the benefit of our children. So let me give you an example of how I often broach the subject with couples. I do premarital counseling with couples, but I also do couple check-ups with couples of all different ages who've been together for different lengths of time. And we tackle the big issues with this program called Prepare Enrich, where we look at money and conflict management and family issues and sex. So couples of every age are asked to separately answer on a scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree with a bunch of statements. So here's some of the examples of the statements on sexual issues. I am comfortable talking with my partner about sexual issues. I'm concerned that my partner's interest in sex might be different than mine. I am reluctant to be affectionate with my partner because he or she often interprets it as a sexual advance. I have concerns about my partner's faithfulness to me. My partner and I talk openly about our sexual expectations. My partner sometimes uses or refuses affection unfairly. I am comfortable with our current level of sexual activity. That's always an interesting conversation. I am completely satisfied with the amount of affection that my partner gives me. So these questions help to create a dialogue that helps to identify each member of the couple's wants and needs. It is a beginning, and an important one. And sometimes it needs facilitation. Now, I am not the first minister to suggest to a congregation that they increase their conversation about sex. You may have heard about the pastor of the Relevant Church in Southwest Florida. I'm not making that name up. Relevant Church in Southwest Florida. The minister, not too long ago, asked married couples in his congregation to have sex for 30 days in a row. And he told the singles to steer clear of sex for the same length of time. So on the one hand, this man is an absolute genius, right? He drew a lot of attention to the topic. He increased the intimacy of those in a committed relationship. And he's encouraging his congregation to be mindful or choiceful about their intimate relationships for those who are single. But on the other hand, everything is still couched in the concept of a particular definition of religious morality. Sex is only for married people, and specifically between a man and a woman. Well, you can breathe easy because I'm not going to ask you to do the same. I'm actually going to ask you to do something a little bit more difficult. I want to suggest this morning that if you're in a committed relationship, that today, not tomorrow, today, you reopen the dialogue about sex and intimacy in your partnership. The best conditions for this conversation, by the way, is not in the heat of the moment. So my suggestion is maybe over dinner or someplace public where you have to whisper. But reopen the conversation about what you like, about what you prefer, about what your ideal frequency would be, and what other ways you feel you express your intimacy besides intercourse. You might be surprised, especially if you can greet this conversation with curiosity, let the other person speak uninterrupted until they're done, refrain from going, "Really?" Because our wants and desires as adults change over time and with circumstance. And everyone has different needs and wants. That's what makes us the unique human beings that we are. So if you're in a relationship, I want you to have this conversation with your partner and see maybe what assumptions that you've been making. We have a tendency to believe that we know how our partners will respond, and yet if you give your partner permission to change their mind, permission to change over time, you might be surprised. I want to give you permission or maybe an excuse to reopen the conversation. So blame me. I often tell my couples, just blame me. Tamara told us we had to talk about this. But reopen the conversation about what a perfect experience might look like. The details. You might be surprised. And if you're single, then what I think, and even if you're partnered, this would still be helpful, then examining your own sexual history is an important way to be able to be fully present in your next relationship. I was trained to be a sex education facilitator in our sex education curriculum here at, it wasn't actually in Oklahoma, but it's our curriculum that we use in the Unitarian Universalist Association. It's called Our Whole Lives. And while I was at this training, one of the things that we had to do was actually to create what they call a sexual timeline, whereby you list in increments of 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, your whole lifespan, and write down the important and significant moments that affected what your perception of sex is. It's a very powerful tool, and it doesn't have to be shared with anyone. But I really suggest, if you're not partnered, to take that time and actually spend some thought on this issue.